The problem with cultural differences isn't a bogeyman. There's case after case after case.
The public are clearly not willing to put up with just the sort of airy platitudes. They want to have a serious conversation about controlling the border.
When things clash, as it did between Beth Upton and Sandie Peggie, it's very obvious who holds the power in that dynamic. It's not all be kind. It's very much be kind or else.
It just never stops. It's not purely going to be when the police turn up that you're going to feel that chilling effect, that demonisation, that ostracisation, purely for expressing perfectly legitimate views.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, delighted to be joined as ever by Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And absolutely thrilled to have returning one of our favourite guests, Spike columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Thanks for coming back on, Ella. We have loads to talk about today. We'll be talking about the rape of a 15-year-old girl by two Afghan asylum seekers, the NHS's persecution of Sandie Peggie, and the never-ending punishment of Royal Marine Jamie Michael. But before we get into that, Tom, you have a very exciting announcement to make about a new book.
Yes, we have a new Spikes book, Vibe Shift by Brendan O'Neill. He's done it again. He's produced another brilliant book in time for Christmas, all about this change in politics that we've all been going through with Trump's election, with the Supreme Court ruling, with the public across Europe and much of the West revolting against greenism and wokeness and technocracy and all the rest of it. It's a really fantastic read. It's going to come out early next year, so we'll be announcing that and putting it out for pre-order very soon. But if you want to get your hands on a signed copy of this, you've got to donate to Spiked this Christmas. We've got a special offer on this year, as we always do. Anyone who gives £50 or more over the Christmas period will get a signed copy of Vibe Shift. And if you're already a Spiked supporter, I should say, you can get your hands on one of these for £30. So go to spiked-online.com/Xmas to make your donations and fund our work as we go into the new year.
So let's talk about this terrible case in Leamington Spa in Warwickshire, where a 15-year-old girl was by two teenage Afghan asylum seekers. They've both been sentenced this week. The case is so horrific that even the boys' lawyers said that if the public were to see the footage of the incident, there would be riots on the streets. Tom, I mean, the reason we're talking about this is not an isolated incident, unfortunately.
No, there's been a string of cases that we've covered on this show, that we've covered on the website, that have been across the media over the course of this year, of people who should never have been in this country in the first place, committing some of the most heinous crimes. And if you read any of the coverage, if you read the court transcripts, if you read the victim impact statements, just tremendously, tremendously heinous. We don't need to pore over it here, but people will have seen the reporting. And particularly this case, I think, is striking for a couple of reasons. There's the fact that, like the Ethiopian asylum seeker from Epping, or like some of the other cases that we might get into, the fact that you've got people coming to this country and within months committing serious violent sexual offences has really hammered home to people that our broken borders are a menace to public safety, particularly to women and girls in this instance. There's also the secrecy that surrounds these cases, although that is starting to break down. The fact that we only learned of the names and identities in this instance was because of a legal battle that the Mail and other journalists fought to have their names revealed. The judge in this case deeming it to be absolutely in the public interest. And again, I think now we're seeing kind of, because of the fact that there is such across the country kind of outcry about the injustice, the horrific injustices which are taking place under our broken asylum system, that they know that the old rules don't really work in the way that they used to. Obviously, in this case, the covering up their names, or not releasing their names, I should say, was under the aegis of their age rather than anything else. But nevertheless, I think it shows where this debate is moving. I think it was also striking that in the case itself, the judge essentially pushed back on the defence lawyer's argument that an element of cultural differences should be taken into account here, saying that whilst you do come from a very different society which sees women in a much more lowly fashion, first of all, I do not accept that undermines your culpability in any meaningful sense. But I thought that was telling, is that even in the midst of the court case, these sorts of issues which have previously been sort of unspoken about are starting to be spoken about. So the discussion about illegal migration and the toll that it's taken the country really isn't going anywhere. And I think the fact that this case has really broken through because the reporting restrictions have melted away in this instance is probably an indication of a level more openness in discussing this and reporting on this that maybe we haven't seen previously.
Ella, it feels like, if you go back 5 years ago, 10 years ago, politicians were falling over themselves to talk about the problems facing women and girls, whether it's catcalling or harassment or sexism in the office or whatever. And yet when we're confronted with some really genuinely horrific crimes, there's a lot more tiptoeing around it. There's an unwillingness to really grapple with these issues.
Yeah, well, the cultural differences thing is really interesting because it's, on the one hand, you understand why people don't want to sound like they are painting everybody from a particular country as a potential abuser. And I have that same feeling. But there is also a complete denial of that. Up until now, there's been a denial of the fact that there are cultural differences, if that's what you want to call them. I mean,
it's almost a slightly soft term, isn't it?
Yeah,
in the
it
context of what we're
doesn't
talking
really
about.
capture what it is if you are, if you're coming from a country in which women are not equal, but treated like dirt.
Yeah,
genuinely oppressed, violently oppressed, and never mind sort of the sexual relations between men and women. It is not unthinkable that there's someone from that country, particularly with this case, two very young men, two boys.
Yeah.
Really, these aren't sort of men in their 20s who've seen things. These are boys who are very clearly acting out things that they think are right and okay. That's a reality you have to confront. And I thought it was also telling of how far we have to go that one of the boys is going to get deported.
Yeah.
And the judge has advised that the other one will. We don't know whether that will happen, but there's even still this sort of hesitancy that, two boys who will be men by the time their sentences have played out it wouldn't be obvious that you just deport them.
Yeah.
Which is depressing. There have been other cases of the man who threw corrosive liquid over woman and child in a car. There have been several cases like that where, it's just not on for the kind of discussion about particularly illegal migration to just be consumed with this whole sort of refugees are lovely, women and children fleeing war, nothing to see here thing, which I think is important to note still is a narrative that gets played out.
Yeah.
If you, anytime you have a discussion about migration, okay, there'll be some people who get a little bit of leeway for conversation, but there is still this sort of tick of people saying, but of course it's people fleeing war. And yeah, there are some like that, but this isn't the whole sort of the problem with cultural differences isn't a bogeyman. It isn't a thing that isn't a reality. There's case after case after case. And if you want to sound like you're doing something serious about women and girls, you have to be particular about what the issues are. Women and girls in this country are not facing on a daily basis. There is not a culture. There is not sort of this moral panic in general doesn't exist. It's very specific incidents, the grooming gang incidents of asylum seekers like this case, that we should focus on and ask hard questions of why has this happened? And because if you want to actually stop it, then you have to get forensic about it. And I think there is an unwillingness to be forensic about it because people are afraid of being racist. And there has to be some way through navigating through that path of, no, you don't label every person from Afghanistan as a potential rapist at the same time as recognizing that there are these cultural differences.
Mm-hmm. And the word culture is interesting because you were talking about the discussion 5 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. It was the high status opinion to suggest that because of lads mags or dapper laughs or something, that our culture was signalling that sexual violence, that treating women terribly, even in a violent fashion, it was almost kind of greenlit and accepted. And yet those arguments seem to completely dry up when you're talking about people coming from a society like Afghanistan, in which under various different regimes there has been a tremendous problem with sexual violence, the likes of which would boggle the mind of anyone who lives in a thankfully much safer, more enlightened Western society. This is clearly something which has to be part of the discussion. And why wouldn't it be? It's the sort of thing that, you would have, again, 10 years ago, maybe read an Amnesty International press release about it. And yet when it mixes up with the issue of migration, suddenly people start staring at their shoelaces about it. And I think now that the public are clearly not willing to put up with just the sort of airy platitudes. They want to have a serious conversation about controlling the border, because all of those deflections, all of those, frankly, just nonsensical arguments about people fleeing war and so on, when in large part, especially in these two scumbags' case, they were fleeing France, as is often the case. It's clear that that kind of cordon sanitaire around this argument is breaking down. And that can only be a good thing. And particularly if you want to have a precisely the kind of discussion which is actually going to sort this problem, which is going to tamp down on the likelihood of this happening again, but also producing any of the kind of tensions that we certainly don't want to see in the country, that can only be a good thing. Not talking about it has been the worst thing possible. Not reporting on it, not looking it in the eye, that has to stop right now. I
completely agree with that, but I think there's something to watch, which is that if you look at when Shabana Mahmood made her big announcement on the new asylum policy, the way in which the Labour Party has framed this new room to converse about the issue is not because we think it has legitimacy because there's real things happening. It's very much about calming down the riotous, the terrible far right threat out there. So the sort of excuse for people being allowed to talk about it is because we have to civilize all these awful people out there who will become, thugs and all the rest of it. And I think that's just important to watch because that's not true. It's not true that people are on the brink of far right extremism, and it's pretty anti-working class for the start. It's like holding these two things at the same time. Yes, I'm really glad that there's some space to have discussions, and that's a good thing. At the same time, I think the Labour Party in particular thinks that they'll bring in this policy, they'll talk hard a little bit, and they'll be the sort of civilizing force, and everybody will go home and go to bed happy. And one, that won't happen, and two, there's a problem with that because at its heart, it's sort of an anti-populist sort of tactic.
Oh yeah, and it becomes a kind of policing how you talk about it, all the while not actually doing anything to solve the source of the problem, which is the broken border. I mean, it was interesting this week where you had again a lot of argument on social media amongst Labourites and former Labourites and all the rest of it, criticising the government for its supposedly horrific rhetoric in relation to the grooming gangs or the issue of illegal migration and sexual violence more broadly. Meanwhile, you look at what they're actually doing, which is sending David Lammy over to Strasbourg to, have a meeting with other European ministers about maybe they'll make a kind of tweak to how judges might be able to interpret. It's not going to touch the size of this issue at all. Simultaneously, they have taken the message, okay, so you don't like the hotels, so what we'll do is we'll put them in an RAF barracks, or we'll put them in this place, or we'll move them into HMOs, or we'll move them into private accommodation, just moving the problem around rather than trying to deal with it at source. So it's important that we have an open debate about it, precisely that we find solutions, not that we've just found a calmer way to talk about it, meanwhile the government does nothing. Yeah. Which is where it feels like we're going towards at the
Letting
moment.
people vent their spleen so that we can not do anything about it. Letting people feel they've had their say. Should we talk about another bit of a strange mixed bag judgment, this one actually. The Sandie Peggie tribunal has finally come to an end. So it was found that she had been harassed by her employer, NHS Fife, after she was disciplined when she put in a formal complaint about a male trans-identified colleague changing with her. But the judgment strangely didn't say that women have an automatic right to single-sex spaces. It was quite convoluted, saying that you do if you complain, but not until you complain, which is a bit of an odd thing. I thought that rights were, only meaningful if they're granted. You shouldn't have to demand them, surely. Exactly,
yeah. Joanna Williams' article on Spiked is really great at just outlining one ordeal this woman's been through.
Oh God, yeah.
And how absurd it is that it has taken, over 300-page publication to ascertain why it would be wrong that a woman would be made to change it in the same space as a man. It's a bit like the sort of the thing around the Supreme Court judgment where you think, this is just nuts that it's had to get to this level to say what everybody knows to be true and normal.
The men have penises and women have vaginas.
Yeah, exactly. But, and you can't overstate what Sandie Peggie has been through. She, from sort of deep scrutiny about her relationship with her daughter, people saying that she was, lying about, having a menstrual flood, which was why she didn't want to change with the male trans-identifying colleague. And again, it's a bit like what we were just talking about, in one breath, they're all sort of women and girls.
Yeah.
Period policies at work, blah, blah, blah. And then the other hand, it's like you lying cow if a woman actually opens her mouth and has an opinion about something. But it is, I think Sandie's case shows how, in a way, flimsy the legal route of combating this is. Because even though you've had Supreme Court judgment, or even though you have sort of, I don't know, Stonewall being taken out of certain institutions and things like that, it still is the case that the sort of the sort of go-to for many of these institutions is to side with the sort of the right on, whether it's trans or whatever else, and to see anyone who has, you know, whether it's a gender critical opinion or anti-Black Lives Matter opinion or whatever it is, as wrong and suspicious, and the one to be sort of investigated rather than the other way around. So, you know, all solidarity to Sandie Peggie, but this was not going to be the last case like this we see. And I don't know whether the answer is to continue having these. The sort of a public legal case is extremely draining on the individual. It's helpful in a way to shine a light on this, but I think there just has to be more kind of, I don't know, just kind of grassroots normal people pushing back and asking questions and speaking up, because this isn't going to be won through the courts, because as we see, it's incredibly difficult, and it's not like every court has suddenly decided to become gender critical. Far from it.
That's true. I mean, even that ringing clear Supreme Court judgment, which just leaves no room for ambiguity as to the legality of single-sex spaces, is still just being ignored left, right and centre down the country. Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, Sandie Peggie is appealing the verdict, and I think one of the reasons, because quite bizarrely, is that it contains a number of made-up quotes. It quotes, for instance, the Meyer Forstater judgment, which basically enshrined gender-critical beliefs as protected in law, and it does this quote about a hierarchy of rights, which doesn't appear anywhere near in the judgment. It also quotes or misquotes the Asher's Bakery case. Yeah. Famously the Christian bakers who didn't want to put a pro-gay message on a cake. A complete misquote. So it seems like, you know, the judiciary, even when they made partially a good decision in terms of saying that Sandie Peggie had been harassed, they are a bit of a shambles, actually, and really not the people we can look to for common sense and guidance on these.
No, exactly. I think inevitably it is going to be tested in court again, not just in the form of this appeal, but there was always going to be these kind of subsequent cases which you would hope formalise and fortify the Supreme Court ruling, but in this case seem to have taken a step back. Because the logic of it is torturous. I mean, I don't claim to be an expert in the Equality Act and how it interacts with various other pieces of legislation, but that core argument, as you gestured to earlier, Fraser, that essentially it's not unlawful to have a man in a women's space until a woman complains about it, at which point it becomes unlawful for a bit, until maybe you change their rotas around, until they don't have to work with one another, and then it's lawful again. It doesn't make any sense, and it obviously completely undermines what we all took the Supreme Court ruling to mean, which is that sex means sex in the Equality Act, and therefore single-sex spaces flow from that. So, and even the length of this thing, was it 312 pages? I think speaks to how convoluted and confused it was. The fact that it seems to be kind of recycling and airing all of the stupid gender ideology talking points. If you were trying to work out how to balance the rights in this situation, you might take into account how much surgery the person's had, or what they look like. So if they're making a bit more effort, maybe they're allowed in the women's space. It doesn't make, this is stuff that we thought we'd knock back, really. And that's why this isn't going to be the end of the litigation, certainly. But also does point to that kind of broader cultural battle which needs to be had out in order to stop these things from ever having to reach a tribunal or what have you. And also the other thing that's in the judgment, which is fascinating, is the kind of implicit and explicit victim blaming in relation to Sandie Peggie, the suggestion that she was expressing herself in her exchanges with Beth Upton, the male doctor who identifies as a woman, that there are permissible and unpermissible, or there are proper and improper ways in which to express that. I mean, it feels like it's very much kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back over the course of this year where this issue is concerned.
And Ella, it does feel this issue is particularly pertinent to working class women. This is, if you're a middle class professional, you don't have to get changed at your job, for instance, just as one example. And this is just a nurse who's been working in the NHS, doing, giving great service for decades, and just being absolutely put through the ringer for holding a belief that people have held since the beginning of time.
Yeah, well, there's obviously the nurse-doctor dynamic here as well, between Beth and Sandie, which is pretty obvious when you read around which individual you'd like to go for a drink with and who's not so very nice. But the thing about it is that there's...
Oh no, lads' weekend, you qualify for that.
There's, we're constantly told that, like kind of the era of be kind politics, that we're told that the main goal of anyone at any time is always to make sure everybody's kind and comfortable. Yeah. And safe. Feels safe and secure in their work and blah blah blah. And it's just you end up sounding like some kind of tub thumping feminist now, because it's just never the case with women in these scenarios. It's whenever there is a clash between trans rights and women's rights, if that's how you want to put it. It's always the woman who is demonized, and it's always the woman who is there's something wrong with her because she's not open to this new world of acceptance.
She needs to be re-educated. I mean, that was what the nurses in Darlington were told. They need to be re-educated to understand why they should change.
Because their discomfort, a lack of privacy or dignity, wasn't an actual discomfort. It was just a misunderstanding of what they should feel. And it's hard not to see the sort of, when you pare it back, the realities here, which is men trying to force women to do things that they don't want to do. Now, there are, if you just have clear guidelines, there's endless room for people to make informal arrangements at work. And there's, I'm sure lots of people will do that. I know that there are lots of people across the country who, are fine with certain things, not fine with certain things. But when things clash, as it did between Beth Upton and Sandie Peggie, it's very obvious who holds the power in that dynamic. Unlike Peggie, Upton hasn't had the kind of intense personal scrutiny, disruption in her career, personal stress, all the rest of it that she's had to be put through. And I just think that tells you something about the balance here that needs to be readdressed, because it's not all be kind. It's very much be kind or else.
Yeah. Yeah. And even this sort of language around competing rights, quite aside from the legal questions therein, doesn't make any sense. Because the reason that women's spaces exist is not to imbue women with a sense that they are women, to validate their identity as women. It's a very kind of clear-cut question of safety, dignity. A lot of these arguments have been aired very well over the course of the past few years, as a lot of very courageous people, primarily women, have been fighting this issue. And yet what we have in this situation is someone who is desperate to use those facilities because it reaffirms their sense of themselves, even though it does not align with biological fact or, frankly, how most of the rest of society happens to see them. You can't reconcile that. You can't reconcile those two claims, those two positions. And it was also interesting reading the judgment and the coverage around it. Again, the recycling of these old canards around, it's not been proven by any meaningful sense that trans women are a elevated threat to women in women's spaces. This is, again, not the point. The reason that you don't allow men into women's changing rooms or bathrooms and so on is not either because all men are this or that all trans-identified men are. It's to say that in a situation like that, you can't tell who is who, and also because of the strength imbalance, because of this and that. It's sort of commonsensical as well as being a very hard one set of rights. So it's a reminder that these things will continue to be fought in court necessarily, it seems like, but also outside of it, because the institutions have always been the problem in terms of enforcing this stuff, even when no one was noticing that these policies were being changed.
And isn't women's just privacy and dignity enough? You don't have to say that someone is the risk of is necessary.
I think this is a really key point, and something that if it exists, to start to splinter out, the gender critical movement needs to take on, because the more you talk about, I mean, I've never agreed with the whole sort of slight moral panic around sexual dangers of all the rest of it, because what that does is it takes away the focus from what most people feel, which is not a risk of or assault, but just a discomfort. It's hard to describe why it feels awkward changing in front of your brother or anyone, any man. It's not to do with feeling physically threatened necessarily. It's just to do with a sense of comradeship between women, of privacy and dignity, or not feeling safe but feeling comfortable. Yeah. And I think actually we need to start talking more about, even I think there's scope to talk about why it's positive to have women's spaces and men's spaces, particularly for in schools and teenagers and things like that. There are things that happen in sex only spaces, which are, not to do with safety, but to do with growing up and learning and chatting. And, I think we need to focus more on why these things are necessary in a sort of for positive reasons rather than in a sort of moral panic way, because the moral panic route leads to bigger problems. And, trans people are not an elevated threat they are a freaking nuisance when they won't get out of your changing room because they want to validate their identity. And that's a sort of a nuanced argument I think we need to get better at making.
And I suppose at the same time, it's also the loophole sort of issue as well. Like because again, it's not to say that people have gone through all of the effort of transitioning or what have you, purely because they've got this nefarious agenda in mind. But as we've seen with Isla Bryson, as we've seen with many of these other horrific situations, there's going to be a non-negligible proportion of people who will just exploit this get out of jail free card, or certainly the golden ticket into the women's space that they otherwise weren't granted. And the naivety in the face of that, again, not enormous, but still, not unimportant level of threat that has been presented by people who the issue of sexual violence is like their totalizing mission has been really, really interesting, from observing this over the past couple of years.
So let's talk about Jamie Michael. People may know Jamie Michael from our film, Think Before You Post. He's one of the speech criminals who was... he was charged with inciting racial hatred. He was held on remand for 17 days. A jury acquitted him after 17 minutes. But, Tom, the ordeal hasn't ended there, because his local safeguarding board, despite his acquittal, have said that he's basically unsafe to be able to work with children, and he can't coach his daughter's football team.
This is a sort of example of how the punishment never stops for people, since that kind of scarlet letter of racism is applied to him, because he has been completely acquitted. People can watch the film and see just how obvious it was that his comments should never landed him in a courtroom in the first place. And yet this is something that incidentally he was telling us about at the time that we were filming the documentary, but the case has only now really come to the surface because it's now something that they're fundraising for and promoting. But it's just a real reminder that the law is not the only issue where freedom of speech, or at least the criminal law is not the only issue where freedom of speech is concerned. So, as you say, he was told by his local safeguarding panel that he was unfit to coach his daughter's football team. That has continued despite the fact that he was acquitted by a jury of his peers. What more vindication could you possibly receive other than that? And as is often the case, Free Speech Union are doing great work to try and face this down. They've also found at least a dozen more cases in which safeguarding rules brought in, particularly in the wake of the Sower murders back in the early 2000s, are being abused and used to punish thought crime and speech crime, effectively. There's another case that's been reported in the Telegraph this week of a teacher who ended up being sacked, suspended, banned from working with children because of some off-the-cuff comments he made about Britain being a Christian country and admonishing some Muslim students for, I think, washing their feet in the sinks of the boys' lavatory. The sort of thing that could have been very easily kind of smoothed out, but suddenly actually becomes you're a threat to children. It actually produced a hate crime investigation and even some sort of child safeguarding investigation on the part of the police. Such was the hysteria that surrounded this particular case. So it just never stops. It doesn't matter if it was a complete miscarriage of justice, as it was in Jamie Michael's case, the fact that he was held on remand, had his life completely thrown into the air, even that controversial, that it's not purely going to be when the police turn up that you're going to feel that chilling effect, that demonisation, that ostracisation, purely for expressing perfectly legitimate views.
Well, it's just watching his interview with Tom and on Think Before You Post, it really brings home how, I don't want to use the word traumatic, but, how big a deal it is to have some, have the police turn up, talk to your girlfriend and then follow you to your work. And then with the footage of when he's being arrested, and they're just kind of making stuff up about, we're arresting you on the basis of this. And he says, well, what racist language?
They said indecent racial hatred, which is not a criminal offence. Which is,
and then he gets to the police. I mean, people should watch the video.
Unless he said it with his trousers around his ankles. I don't understand how that would have actually worked.
He gets to the police station. They can't load the video because, the Wi-Fi isn't working or something. And this is just absurd. It's like Kafkaesque. It's absurd. And yet, as Luke Gittos, who's in the film, details, he's held there for 17 days. That is insane. Held 17 days, misses his daughter's birthday. All of these things which really screw up your life.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never been arrested. I don't ever want to be because it's a big deal. And all of this from the basis of a video which, we at Spiked have defended many people who've said... pretty nice.
Much worse. Genuinely horrible.
Worse things because we believe in free speech. Jamie Michael didn't say anything that bad. He actually went out of his way to say it was quite a political little speech about going to politicians and all the rest of it. And then you find out that the person who complained is not just some busybody on social media, but again, it's a politically motivated push from somebody working with politicians, and it's part of this, there was part of this wider sort of push from the political elite to be seen like they were doing something in the wake of the Southport riots by criminalising basically just anyone they could find.
Yeah.
And I think it's such an important story to show how censorship is used by a political elite to try and not just control the discussion about whatever's happening, but also to frighten people. Because it's a really frightening thing that's happened to him and that has happened to other people, because you would definitely think twice before saying anything else after that had happened. Your career ruined, your family life disrupted. This is genuine sort of, it's like state oppression. It's at a level which I don't think people realise how serious it is. And I just think hats off to Jamie, because he was given the option to say that he was guilty. It would have reduced his sentence, all the rest of it. And he's, stuck by his guns and said, no, we need more people like him. And
it does feel as if speech crimes are not only, we know the police pursue them particularly zealously, but it's as if the authorities take them much more seriously than real crimes. Because you can imagine someone who's committed, a fairly serious offence like a burglary or something, maybe they've done their time. The normal liberal response to say, well, let's rehabilitate this person, let's bring them back into society. Why shouldn't, it's great they want to coach a football team, amazing, let's help them out. Whereas Jamie Michael, who is totally innocent, is not allowed to do normal things because his transgression was a speech crime. It was a political transgression.
No, exactly. And it is worth stressing, because a part of the way in which the punishment continues is the way in which a name continues to be dragged through the mud. I was talking about this case on LBC earlier this week, and then the caller directly after me, some sort of safeguarding consultant, openly said that in his video he had referred to people of colour as scumbags and psychopaths. Completely untrue. The various people calling up afterwards being like, well, what if a young, ethnic minority girl joined that football team? How would they feel? He wasn't talking about race in any way, shape or form. I mean, Luke puts it very well in the film, is that the only way that you could possibly sustain the reading of what he said in that video as racial hatred would be if that you completely tortured it, took things out of context, took the worst possible reading of every single thing that he said. And particularly because the crackdown on speech after Southport was very much prefaced as part and parcel of the crackdown on the violence. There was this sense in which Keir Starmer explicitly went on the airwaves and said, people who are perpetrating this violence, whether on the streets or ginning it up online, will meet the full force of the law. In that video, he explicitly says, this is not about violence, this is about doing things in the right way, about having meetings with politicians, as Ella was saying there. And the substance of what he's saying, he said by his own admission, things were a little bit clumsily expressed here or there. He was very angry. He also, repeated the claim, since proven to be false, that Axel Rueda-Cabana, the Southport killer, wasn't born in Cardiff. That's something that he's accepted. And of course, there was a lot of misinformation swirling at the time. But the substance of what he's saying has been vindicated by events, that if you have illegal migration, then there are going to be people allowed into the country who will do harm. It's not all of them, but it's going to be enough of them to cause a real problem. And it's ever since that horrific summer, both in terms of the first and foremost the stabbings themselves, but also the unrest which consumed many towns and cities afterwards. It's shown that many of the points he was making in that video have been vindicated. You do not stick up for free speech for people on the basis of whether or not you think they've got a point, but in this case he did, and yet he's being punished for having expressed it.
Right. Well, the conversation does not end there, because we're about to go over to Spiked Podcast Unlocked.
There is a interesting, worrying trend among general right-wingers towards the idea that what people really need is a return to God, family values, and when you really get to grips with what all of that means, it's all about women.
If you're not a Spiked supporter, then please sign up now so you can hear the rest of the conversation. Go to spiked-online.com/support. Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.